The presentation that I am going to give you is actually an English translation of a presentation that was given in the German VuFind Summit last month by David Maus, who has been a really great contributor to the VuFind code since the 2.0 redesign. He's the sort of person that you love to have in an open source community. He says, this is the ugliest and most horrible, complicated piece of code in VuFind 1. I'm going to completely rewrite it for you so that it's better. And then he actually follows through on that and does that. So this presentation will look at what he has done, how the new VuFind search interface works, and what you can do with it. And I apologize in advance. There's almost no way to make a half-hour presentation talking about code really exciting. And I'm going to throw a ton of things at you, and I don't expect all of them to stick, but basically I hope you at least come away from this with an idea of why we did what we did, what's possible, and the general shape of it. The rest of it you'll just have to dig into the code to get a feel. And I should also say that the original presentation had several slides that were just full of PHP code, and I cut those out for your sanity. So this could be longer and more painful. So first of all, let's look at some of the paradigms of VuFind 2, just to set the stage for how the new code is designed. First of all, of course, it's based on Zen Framework 2. And David added the note here that if you're in doubt about anything about Zen Framework 2, just look at the source code because the documentation is sometimes a little bit lacking. We're also using PHP namespaces and a class loader. So while the VuFind 1 code had potential name collisions and was full of require statements to pull in all of the different pieces, the VuFind 2 code has more elegant naming for things, and everything just works magically because of the class loader. VuFind 2, like VuFind 1, follows the front controller pattern, which simply means that all of the requests that come into VuFind get sent to the same single PHP script, and then it routes that out to the appropriate code based on conditions like what is the URL. And finally, we use what Zen Framework 2 calls the service manager as a central registry. So rather than having global variables, which VuFind 1 had a few of, we instead use this registry which contains objects that provide services that various parts of the VuFind code use. This isn't a perfect solution, but it's a little bit more controlled than the global situation. And it also provides a really nice mechanism for overriding things with local customizations, because you can plug in new services in the spots where old services were, and the rest of the code will just continue to work seamlessly. So what was wrong with the VuFind 1 code? Actually, show of hands, has anyone looked at the Solr searching code in VuFind 1? I'm just curious. So essentially, it was code that grew organically. It started out as just a lightweight thing that sent a couple of parameters to Solr, and then it got the YAML configuration stuff lumped on top of it, and then it got all this query cleaning stuff on top of that so that bad searches could be made good. And you ended up with this endless lump of code doing 20 different things all on top of each other. And it mostly worked based on the works for me philosophy. You hack at it till it does what you want, and then you stop. And then somebody else comes along and hacks at it some more. So there was a lot of unrelated functionality coupled together. Talking to Solr generally, the specific VuFind schema, there are references to that in there. The functionality of the top-level web application was closely tied to the low-level query processing, etc. So it was hard to understand, it was hard to extend, it worked by magic. But we loved it because it did what we wanted most of the time. So the design principles that guided the VuFind 2 version of this were first of all separation of concerns. So rather than having one big class that does everything, have lots of little classes that do more specific things. So for example, the act of turning the VuFind query parameters into an actual Solr query gets its own class that just does that. Additionally, a separation between the functionality of searching and the application of VuFind. So we actually end up with two different namespaces in VuFind. We have VuFind Search, all one word, which is its own module within VuFind 2, and is just a generic search framework that has nothing VuFind specific in it. It's just a model of searching. And then we have VuFind \search, a namespace within the core VuFind module that actually uses that generic searching framework to do what VuFind does. A lot of the basic design philosophy here is parameter aggregation. So a Solr search is just a set of parameters sent to Solr. You know, your query is in Q and your filter queries are in FQ and so on. So a lot of how the new search system works is by having different pieces of code add parameters to what's called a param bag, and then that final bag gets sent off to Solr and does its thing. So there's now sort of a tighter relationship between what VuFind does and what Solr does, but I think it's a well-defined relationship. And finally, we use events as extension points. So Zen Framework offers a flexible event manager, which means that in various points in your code you can say this event is happening and send some particular objects to the event manager. And other people can write code that listens for that event and then manipulates those objects. This can be somewhat mind-bending because event-driven programming is inherently mind-bending because things no longer flow in the straight line that some of us would like them to, but it's very powerful and very flexible because it means that you can write isolated standalone code that just changes the behavior of VuFind without having to understand its deep inner workings. And you will hear later today of one useful application of that. So sort of the core search class for doing Solr searching in VuFind 2 is what's called the Solr backend. And this is just a dependency diagram. So we have our search backend, which relies on a query builder, which is the code I talked about that turns the VuFind parameters into an actual working Solr query. And this is what, for example, processes that huge YAML configuration file that says, you know, this field has this weight and you should add these filters and so forth. We also have what's called a record collection factory, which is responsible for taking the Solr response and turning that into record driver objects that VuFind can use, you know, in the higher level code. And finally, we have a Solr connector, which is responsible for actually talking to Solr itself. And then the connector in turn relies on, of course, an HTTP client, which is provided by Zen Framework, since we have to talk to Solr over HTTP, and also on what's called a handler map, which is where you're able to configure how your particular Solr instance is set up. You know, what is the name of your search handler, what is the name of your terms handler, etc. So all this used to just be one big monolithic class. Now it's a bunch of related pieces that work together. So what does the backend do? It translates search requests into Solr parameters. Currently, it's hard-coded to use the JSON response format just for the sake of simplicity, and it will yell at you if you try to tell it to give you XML. It uses the query builder to turn, you know, search field plus search term into full Solr syntax. It also takes care of setting up spelling and highlighting queries if you need those things. Then the backend delegates to the connector to actually talk to Solr, pulls the response back, and then using the factory pattern builds your record drivers. So what does the connector do? As I say, this is the connection to the Solr index, which uses the handler map to configure how the particular operations are set up. It uses HTTP, and it throws exceptions if something goes wrong. And it throws fairly targeted exceptions so you can differentiate between the search system failed versus Solr is offline, or Solr doesn't like what I just said to it. So now we have the record collection factory, which, as I say, is what takes the Solr response and turns that into a set of record objects that VuFind can work with. So right now, it always returns what is called a record collection object. And on the to-do list is making it capable of returning different types of objects for different types of responses. Right now we're still very search focused. The other piece of this is that the record collection actually contains not just an array of records, the record drivers based on each individual item within the response, but it also wraps other elements that come back from Solr, such as how many total records are available, what are the facet values, etc. So then another important piece is I've just described to you what a Solr backend looks like. But you can have, in VuFind, a whole bunch of different backends because you have multiple Solr cores. So you might want one backend for your Biblio core, one backend for your authority core, etc. And so you'll also notice that we're now outside of the VuFind no backslash search namespace and into VuFind backslash search namespace. This is a difficult thing to talk about, but my point is that we've moved out of the generic framework. We're now into the specific VuFind implementation. So VuFind has the search backend manager, which is a scoped service manager whose responsibility is to keep track of all of your backends. So if you've worked with VuFind 2, you know there's the module.config.php where you can define how all of the services that VuFind uses are set up. So VuFind has a section in there that sets up all of the search backends using the factory pattern. So there are actually factory classes for the various search types that build the backend, build the connector, build the query builder, stick it all together the way it needs to go. And these are easily subclassed if you have custom Solr instances that you need to talk to. Now back at the framework level, we also have the top level VuFind search service. And the purpose of this is to create a wrapper around all of your backends so that you have a generic way of performing search operations. Essentially, every operation that you could perform, do a search, retrieve a record, etc., takes a first parameter that is which search backend do I want to use to perform this search, and then it wraps everything. And the main purpose of having this top-level wrapper is that this is where the event system is tied into everything. So when you say, I want to do a search at the high level, it triggers events before and after the search that allow manipulation of the incoming parameters and the outgoing response. It traps errors and lets you analyze them through event listeners, etc. So let's talk about all of the events that are possible. First of all, there's an event called event resolve. As I say, the first parameter that you send to the search service when you're doing anything is which backend that you want the search service to use to perform that search. And the way that the service finds the backend is it triggers the event resolve event and then sees what comes back from that event. So in the particular VuFind instance, what happens is we hook the resolve event, we load our backend manager, we use it to get the service, and we send it back as a response to the event. But if you have some other mechanism that you want to use to come up with backend objects, you can hook this event and send the backend through a different way. Or if you want to override a particular backend, you can hook the event at a higher level of priority than the default VuFind hook and just pass back your own backend. And as it says here, the event is short-circuited. So the first event listener that gives it a backend ends the event, and then the code just goes on and uses that backend object to do whatever operation it's going to do. So then all of the other standard operations have pre and post events, be this search or retrieve. So say you're going to do a search. Before it sends your query to Solr, it triggers a pre-event where you could set up a listener that examines the parameters of the query and say take some away or add some more. Then after the event has been triggered, the post event kicks off, and that contains the search response. So if you want to, say, change the formatting of the records or build things in a different way, you can grab it there. Finally, there's an error event. So if anything along the way throws an exception, this event gets called and gives you the opportunity to examine and modify the exception before it gets thrown again. And the use case for this is that we have some code that looks at the Solr response and determines whether or not it's a parse error based on user input, so that we can display sort of a friendlier message than the exception screen if somebody just typed something weird in the search field. But this was problematic because Solr 3 and Solr 4 have completely different response formats. And so if you want to support all of that, you end up with code that says, well, try this. If it doesn't parse this way, try that. If it doesn't parse that way, I don't know what's going on. But using this event model lets you create listeners that know how to handle the Solr 3 and the Solr 4 case. You can either enable both of them, and that's the same as that if-else statement, but in a more clean design. Or if you know you're only going to be using one particular version of Solr, you can turn off the listener that you don't need, and things are a little bit more targeted. So here is a beautiful diagram of the entire search process. So what you see here is somebody does a search on the search service. Yeah, do I have a laser pointer?
I can get you a laser pointer.
I didn't plan ahead this far.
I got one, Damien.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So here is a search coming in to the search service. So this triggers a resolve event, which gives us the search backend. Then we trigger the pre-event, which can be used to manipulate the parameters to the search that we're going to perform. At this point, we actually call the search method of the backend object. So now we're in the backend. The backend then delegates to the query builder object, which converts the standard, search terms and search handler input into more Solr parameters. Then right now the backend selects the hard-coded JSON response writer, and now it calls search on the Solr connector, just using that big pool of parameters it's built from all of the different inputs. Then the connector uses the handler map to pick which handler to talk to, formats the parameters, and then goes off to HTTP to Solr. So Solr returns the response. The connector passes the response body back to the backend. The backend deserializes that. Then it calls the factory method of the collection factory, which turns that raw response into something more useful. Then the backend does what's called injecting the source identifier. It basically loops through all of the records that were created by the collection factory and says, they came from me, I'm this backend. Then that gets passed back to the search service, which triggers the post event so that the collection can be modified on the fly if there's some reason to do that. And then the service passes the whole thing back. So it's a little bit complicated, but I hope it's at least clear. There are a bunch of things that are all doing well-defined tasks in a clearly related way, which is much better than the old diagram, which would have been one big yellow box.
So just to poke at that a little bit more.
Sure.
So the source, injecting the source identifier, could you remind us what kinds of backends there are today?
Oh, certainly. So we've mostly been focusing on...
Could you repeat the question into the mic?
Oh, sure. The question was, could I talk about what types of search backends exist today? So this has mostly been looking at the Solr backends. And for those, we've got the standard Biblio one, which is used for most searches. We also have an authority backend. We have a course reserves backend. We now have a website backend. I think those are the 4 major Solr ones.
Browse handler a backend, or is that, no, that's different?
You've got a follow-up question. We'll finish this one and then I'll go to that.
Right.
So we also have backends for non-Solr things. So we have Summon and we have Paspar2 and WorldCat. And all of those are designed along similar lines to this. They all have a connector and a query builder and a collection factory. But of course, the exact details of how those work vary a little bit. For example, the Summon one, the connector actually is not part of the VuFind code, but is the connector provided by Serials Solutions. We just talked to that directly from our backend. So the other question was, how does the browse handler fit into all of this? And that's where there was that slide earlier that said, gee, it would be nice if search could return something other than a record collection. So right now, the backends really always return record collections. So you do a search, you get a record collection with the search results. You do a retrieve of a single record, you get a record collection with one thing in it. And so things like the browse handler and the terms handler don't fit that model nicely. So the way that we're dealing with that is that actually the backend has custom methods that are Solr specific that say get me browse results or get me terms results. So instead of going through the search service, we actually directly pull the back end and ask it to perform specific operations. But it might be nice if there were higher level, more abstract ways of doing some of those things. And it may become more apparent how to approach that as we have more backends that are capable of performing those types of operations. The other little gory detail that may be of some interest is that this is the most generic case, but we actually have some interfaces that backends can implement to activate advanced functionality at the service level. So, for example, there's a retrieve multiple records function. So if you have an array of IDs and you want to get those all back, you can ask the search service and it will do that. And the way it works is it looks at the backend and sees if it implements the multi-ID aware interface. If it does, it just calls, get me multiple records on the backend. If it doesn't implement that interface, then it does a for loop and it calls retrieve over and over again for every one of those IDs. So there's some little clever details like that. And there's room to add more of those. So moving on from there, what is next? This says summer 2014 for VuFind 2.2. I think that's actually a very conservative estimate. I think it's likely that we'll get to 2.2 sooner than that, but maybe I shouldn't say that while I'm being filmed. But anyway, these are some things that David would like to see happen. One being more parameter aggregation at the higher levels. Right now, even though VuFind is released and is stable, it still has some growing pains in the search area because we've completely redesigned the low-level stuff that used to be websys solr.php. And we've torn apart the thing that used to be websys search object solr.php so that it's a little bit more separated, but it still feels like some aspects of the design are tied to how things were in VuFind 1, and we just haven't refactored enough to escape completely. So David's working on some ways of getting rid of more legacy code and having a more pure way of converting the incoming VuFind query parameters into the underlying search system parameters. So I expect to see that continue evolving. Custom faceting behavior, as I mentioned in the roundup earlier, we now have new types of faceting available, not facets and or facets. And perhaps there's a more elegant way of incorporating that functionality into the search backend system than what I have done so far. And also, as we just discussed, supporting other response types than simply record collection. And that's that is it. But are there any questions about this?
Okay, I have two questions. One is about the continued refactoring that David says he wants to do. If we're ready to start implementing our own search objects, for example, for Primo, is there going to be a lot of stuff changing that we'll then have to like rework a lot more, or should we feel confident that we can go ahead and do that and we won't be too disrupted in the future?
So the question is, with ongoing refactoring, should people wanting to design their own search backends be worried that things are going to get pulled out from under them as new versions come along? And I think at this point, I wouldn't worry too much about that because the lower level search backend stuff I think is fairly stable. We're probably going to add capabilities. We may add more interfaces you can implement to get more things. But the core functionality of searching and retrieving records is quite stable. I don't expect that to change dramatically. Additionally, if you're doing customizations on top of this, because so much of it is now event-driven and interface-driven, we're going to try to keep those things stable. So even if some of the internals change, if you're hooking an event and doing something, it is my intention that you will be able to continue hooking that event and doing that same thing, and it will continue to work the same way. Where it's probably going to still continue to change more significantly is a little higher level in the application. Right now there's a page in the wiki that tells you how to create a new search backend, and it's like a 26-step document of, create all of these things and all of these routes, and I suspect that some of that is going to get collapsed and simplified because right now it takes a lot of glue just to get all of the controllers set up where you want them and the search options, parameters, and results objects and all of that. So that's the area that's most likely to change and might throw some problems at you. But that's also mostly all boilerplate stuff. So likely the changes that come will be replace this complicated boilerplate with this less complicated boilerplate. But the underlying functionality should be fairly stable.
And then about the faceting, the new faceting stuff, is there a place that we can go to see what the interface looks like for that? Or
Let's have an impromptu live demo. So one of the reasons that it took 4 years for me to implement this faceting thing is because the interface seemed impossibly...
It's a tricky problem.
Yeah. No, that's not right. Now everyone is seeing the secret name of my test server broadcast around the world. Oh, and also I didn't turn it on this morning, so that's not going to work at all. So I can show you a demo of that later on after I've turned my server on. But essentially, the way the interface works is you can configure any field to be either and or. So it doesn't support both cases right now. So if it's and, you get what you've always had. If it's or, you get checkboxes next to every facet. And so as you click more checkboxes, they get ordered together. And of course,
Sort of start out all clicked and
they
unclick them?
no, you click them to select them. But depending on whether it's and or, the value retrieval is different. So if it's anded, you get only the facet values in the current result set. If it's ored, you get the top level facet values, because otherwise, as soon as you clicked one, you wouldn't be able to click anymore because they would go away because you had limited your results. And for not, you just get a little X to the right side of the facet to kill it. So it's simple, but it's the most functional faceting interface with those features that I've seen, because I've seen a lot that I don't like, and this one at least doesn't make me cringe, though I'm sure it could still be better yet.
And Damien, when you do
There are a couple ways to approach that. Actually, that's a good excuse to talk about a few different things. So the question was, can you auto-enable facet exclusions? So at the most basic level, you have the hidden filters functionality that's always been in VuFind. So if you just want to get rid of something and not have the user have the ability to get it back, you can just configure exclude this facet through the config files, and it's gone and you're done. But I assume that's not what you're actually asking about. So one open Jira ticket that's fairly high on my priority list to start thinking about talks about having default selected facets configurable in some way so that you can start VuFind with some facets on and then have the ability to turn them off. And I'm still not quite sure how to approach that, but I've had some ideas and I'm going to keep brainstorming on it. So there might be some developments there. The last piece of this is that this actually comes down to an application of the search system I just described, because here at Villanova, we subscribe to Summon, and Summon has a lot of newspaper articles in it, and they're annoying because they flood the result list and confuse everyone. So Summon provides a checkbox that says exclude newspapers, but we wanted a checkbox that said include newspapers. So the way we ended up implementing that in VuFind 2 was through the event system. So what we did is we configured a checkbox facet that applies a filter called include newspapers : true, which is a fictional field that does not really exist in the Solr index. Then we wrote a listener that hooks the search.pre, and it looks through the selected filters. If it finds include newspapers, it sets a flag. If it doesn't find include newspapers, it adds the exclude newspapers filter to the search terms. So basically, and that's all the code that's necessary. So we have a checkbox that when they select it, it adds a facet, and then we have a listener that looks for that fictional facet and converts it into a real facet based on its presence or absence. And that's the sort of thing that this design is so much nicer than what we had to do in VuFind 1, where we actually had to create a custom subclass of the summon connector that had this logic in it, and then you're hacking at the core of the code just to add one little checkbox. But of course, the obvious downside to this is that there are now 12 things where there used to be one thing, and so you can never completely escape complexity. Oh, sure, sure. We have to kill a few minutes so that lunch is ready. So.
I'll just read the.
It's 153, 104, 170.
I've got the first two parts of that.
153, 104, 170, 183 /viewfind.
All right, so here we have the OR facets enabled for format, so we can say newspaper or journal, but we don't like letters. It's somehow really satisfying to just go through here and delete all of the facet values. Oh, I really hate that blank value facet.
Is it affecting the number of results that come by?
It should be. So there's 484, and if we get rid of... Oh, no, it isn't. Why is that not doing anything? Yeah.
Well, it seems unlikely that a record is going to have more than one format. So if it's a newspaper or a journal, it's not going to be an image or a reality.
Right. Yeah. The dangers of running a live demo. I'm pretty sure that if this were my server, it would be working.
And how do you get back to the old operator? The old
Well, right now it's configured in the searches.ini, so
So the user can.
currently the user can't. And I think it would be useful for the user to be able to do that, but the question is, how do you create an interface that is in any way comprehensible that accomplishes that?
So if it's an and facet, doesn't have the checkbox, but it still has the X.
Exactly. And I also should specify that these checkboxes are dynamically injected by JavaScript code. So for the 3 people on Earth who have JavaScript disabled in their browser, they won't be staring at a bunch of non-functional checkboxes. They actually, if they click the text, they'll get the same functionality as clicking the checkboxes. So I believe in supporting non-JavaScript functionality for those 3 people. I care about them deeply.
Links is appreciated.
I like links. Well, if there are no other, oh, there we go.
Is there, by the way, any major functionality in VuFind's that's not compatible with non-JavaScript enabled process?
There are a few functions in VuFind 2 that don't work with JavaScript enabled. I think the checkbox facets that I mentioned are one of those things. The advanced search is completely broken without JavaScript. I think those are possibly the biggest things. We have Jira tickets for all known JavaScript compatibility issues, and nobody's working on those tickets.
Just asking because we don't even try.
Well, the thing about supporting JavaScript disabled is that it is really useful when you have a bug in your JavaScript and you want to know if you have a bug in your JavaScript or if it's something more underlying. I often do find myself disabling JavaScript and retrying things to see if it behaves differently, particularly in situations in VuFind where there are light boxes popping up and you just don't know if the light box is what is the problem or the content of it. All right, so we've got 13 minutes to kill before lunch, and I'm standing up here. Do we want to turn this into an Ask Anything? Well,
Quali Olay drivers. When?
ask David Lacey.
Working on it right now. We are currently testing the circulation API coming out of Olay, but the framework for the VuFind side of the driver is functional. The Olay API is under development.
So for anyone who missed that question and that answer, the question was, when will the Koali Olay driver for VuFind be ready? And the answer was, it is currently under development. And the answer was longer than that, but I'm not going to try to repeat all of it. I'm also told that lunch is ready, so if there's no more anything that people would like to ask me, you can just rush en masse toward the food.
Or, orderly walkovers. Also.
Is there a big difference between VuFind 1 and 2 when it comes to how the themes are handled?
How the feed?
Themes?
Oh, the themes. There's a significant difference between VuFind 1 and VuFind 2 themes in a couple of ways. First of all, VuFind 1, the templates are all Smarty templates. VuFind 2, they're just raw PHP templates. Additionally, the 2.0 theme inheritance mechanism is significantly more flexible than VuFind 1. So VuFind 1, you actually had to configure a comma-separated list of themes to tell VuFind how to find files in the right places. But now themes actually have their own configuration file which defines who their parent is, and then all of the inheritance is handled automatically. So you can now say my theme is Villanova instead of my theme is Villanova, classic.
Is the mobile theme still separate?
Yes, you get a default standard theme. By default, there's no mobile theme enabled, but VuFind comes with a jQuery mobile-based mobile theme that if you turn it on, will be activated when a mobile device is detected. The other thing that VuFind 2 adds in the area of themes is the ability to create a list of configurable themes. So you can create actually a drop-down and let the user choose what theme they want. So if you wanted to have 15 different color arrangements that they could choose from, you can do that now. Or you can also set it up so that a particular query parameter activates a particular theme. So if you find one, you could say UI equals mobile to force the mobile theme, or UI equals standard to force the standard theme. Now you can define arbitrary UI parameters that load arbitrary themes.
Since you mentioned the advanced search, I'm just wondering, are there any thoughts on how one would make the advanced search less challenging to modify?
So the question was, are there any thoughts on how to make the advanced search code less challenging to modify? We have an open ticket about creating a guided search that is less convoluted than the current advanced search, but there hasn't been a whole lot of movement there apart from Luke O'Sullivan recently posting some screenshots of some database or other with as an idea of what we could work toward. I suppose that the advanced search screen really is one of the last areas of the code that is significantly copied and pasted from VuFind 1 and hasn't been made friendlier. The glorious victory being the alphabetical browse module that was previously completely written in JavaScript and incomprehensible, which Chris rewrote to actually work server-side and make sense. So I guess the answer is I don't have a good answer right now, but it's something that's worth doing if someone has ideas. And in general, I would like to have a more flexible way of mapping different interfaces to that set of query parameters so that if you don't like the way we've implemented advanced search, you can do it a different way. I really kind of like our advanced search screen because it makes more sense to me than most advanced searches, but it also doesn't look like most advanced searches, so it perhaps makes less sense to other people. I just hate that screen where you have the Boolean drop-down next to every single line and you can't tell where the parentheses live. But that's what people seem to want, so what can I say?